Things are getting way too crazy in here. These new workers are just getting in the way, and my profits are drying up. Back when I did everything myself, it was a lot simpler. But I was working my fingers to the bone, taking orders, doing all the cooking and preparations. I was making 25 burgers on a good day. But I couldn't keep up with demand, so I hired a cook. That really helped. And my output shot up to 100 burgers a day. But that line out there didn't seem to get any shorter. So I hired another worker to help with food preparation. And by gosh, if we didn't double our production to 200 burgers a day. More and more people heard about our great burgers and fast service.
Have you tried that ostrich burger joint yet? Oh, they make a mean burger.
With all the great reviews, we just couldn't make them fast enough. So, over the next few weeks, I hired 3 more workers. 1 to take orders, 1 to handle drinks, and 1 to wash dishes. And you know, I guess my expectations were too high. But the 6 of us could only make 350 burgers a day. I was worried about working my cook too hard. He was going crazy just trying to keep up. So I hired another one. Now that I've got all these workers in here, I see the real problem clear as a bell. It's become too crowded. There's barely room to breathe, and 350 burgers a day is just about the most we can make in this restaurant. With all these workers, my costs have gone way up, but that hasn't done much for productivity. If only my kitchen weren't so small. Obviously, I've got too many workers in this little place. Either some of them get laid off, or I need to build a bigger restaurant.
Marge is aware of increased market demand for O-burgers. She's hired more workers to increase production, but in doing so, she has crowded her kitchen and outgrown her facility.
Now that I've got all these workers in here, I see the real problem clear as a bell. It's become too crowded. There's barely room to breathe, and 350 burgers a day is just about the most we can make in this restaurant.
Marge's restaurant building is a fixed resource. A fixed resource is defined as a resource that cannot be changed in the short term. Marge needs to build a bigger and better restaurant, and that takes time. For the time being, Marge has only one resource she can control: labor. Labor is a variable resource. Marge can hire and fire workers as she sees fit to adjust to economic conditions. In economic terms, Marge operates in the short run. This is a situation where at least one resource is fixed, in this case, her building and her equipment. In the long run, no resources are fixed. Marge can build a new restaurant, add grills, soda fountains, or fryers, but once she's acted upon these decisions, she is bound by them and is faced with a new short-run situation. Let's examine her current dilemma. As more labor was added, Marge saw her output, referred to as total product, increase quickly, then more slowly until adding a 7th worker did not add anything more to production. This phenomenon is called diminishing marginal return. When Marge was alone, she had to do it all: take orders, cook burgers, fill the sodas, and clean up when there was time. Adding a cook increased the number of burgers she could produce in a day to 100. Adding a person to handle food preparation helped even more. Specialization made each of them more productive. When Marge added a counter person, a drinks person, and a dishwasher, she noticed that her output had increased, but not as dramatically. By the time Marge added a 2nd cook, workers barely had room to move, and output actually decreased. By connecting all the points on the graph, we derive the total product curve. If we examine the change in output as each worker is added, we derive the marginal product curve. Let's consider Marge worker number 1. By adding the 2nd and 3rd workers to her operation, Marge was able to increase output substantially. With these workers, she experienced increasing marginal productivity. When the fourth worker was added, total output increased, but not as much. With the addition of this worker, marginal product declined. This trend continues as the fifth and sixth workers are added. Marginal product keeps decreasing but remains positive, while total product reaches its maximum when Marge is joined by 5 additional workers. When the seventh worker is added, marginal product becomes negative and total product decreases. Like all operations, Ostrich Burger has a point where, as more workers are added, the marginal product becomes smaller and smaller. This demonstrates the law of diminishing marginal productivity, which states that additional units of a variable resource eventually yield decreasing marginal product.
Things are getting way too crazy in here. These new workers are just getting in the way, and my profits are drying up.
Marge does not yet fully understand the relationship between production and costs. She's hired lots of workers in her effort to make more burgers, and now she's faced with a large payroll and diminishing productivity. Let's examine the costs associated with employing that labor. Labor is a short-term variable cost which changes as Marge hires and fires workers. In a competitive market like Pleasantville, Marge can hire as many workers as she needs at the market wage. We can convert these quantity of labor figures into costs by assuming that the market wage is $50 per day. The numbers along the x-axis now represent the cost of labor. For the purpose of a clear illustration, let's flip the graph around by swapping the x and y axes. The result is a curve representing Marge's total variable cost. In other words, her cost of labor at each level of output. The curve shows that total variable cost rises relatively slowly at first, when there are fewer workers, working conditions are good, and productivity is high. In other words, when marginal product is increasing, total variable cost rises slowly. At higher levels of production, the curve rises sharply because each new addition to the payroll adds less and less to total output due to diminishing marginal productivity. Now let's examine her fixed costs. The costs associated with her building are independent of output. She incurs these costs even if nothing is produced. Because these costs are fixed and do not change at different levels of production, the total fixed cost curve is flat. Total cost is simply total fixed cost plus total variable cost. Since Marge's goal is to maximize her profit, she must produce with maximum efficiency. She would like to know how increases in production affect her total costs. In economic terms, she needs to understand her marginal cost. Marginal cost is the change in total cost resulting from a 1-unit change in output. The curve shows that marginal cost decreases at first due to increasing marginal productivity, then rises due to decreasing marginal productivity when each new worker adds less and less to total output.
Phew! Enough about costs already. You're wearing me out.
Hold on, Marge. In addition to knowing your total cost and marginal cost, you would do well to examine your average cost figures, which are total cost figures divided by the number of units of output. In the short term, average fixed cost is total fixed cost divided by the number of units produced. The curve for average fixed costs clearly shows that as production increases, the average fixed cost decreases. The average variable cost is total variable cost divided by the number of units produced. The average variable cost curve is U-shaped. In this case, it falls to a minimum at around 250 burgers per day and then rises. Average total cost is derived in the same manner by dividing total cost by the number of units produced. The average total cost curve is also U-shaped, falling to a minimum at around 300 burgers per day, then rising. When we overlay the marginal cost curve, we see that it intersects the average total cost and average variable cost curves at their minimum points. Both of these curves are downward sloping when marginal cost is below them, and they are upward sloping when marginal cost is above them.
Tell me, what's the average total cost of a 2-week vacation these days? Obviously, I've got too many workers in this little place. Either some of them get laid off or I need to build a bigger restaurant.
When Marge talks of building a bigger restaurant, she is pondering a long-run decision. In the short run, Marge manages her output and costs by varying the number of workers she employs. But in the long run, all inputs are variable. The long run is defined as a period of time in which all inputs to production, including buildings and capital equipment, can be varied. In other words, in the long run, all costs are variable. There are no fixed costs. Let's consider the 3 stages in the growth of Ostrich Burger up to this point. For each stage, the push cart, the shack, and the quick service stand, there is an associated average total cost curve. The progression of the curves shows that for each facility, there is a unique output level which minimizes average total cost. There is also a range of production output in which each facility operates most efficiently. For quantities up to 150 burgers a day, the push cart is the most efficient means of production. Between 150 and 250 burgers a day, the shack is most efficient. And at quantities over 250 burgers a day, the walk-up restaurant is most efficient. Analysis of these curves leads us to believe that there must be another short-run average total cost curve representing a larger, newer facility. To aid Marge in her long-term planning, we draw a line that passes through the minimum points of each individual average cost curve to approximate the long-run average cost curve. This curve represents the lowest possible long-run average cost of producing any given output. In the long run, Marge has the ability to change all inputs to production.
On an average day, I have 100 dishes to wash. I've got my eye on a new machine that'll do 5 times the number of dishes that a worker can do by hand in the same time. But I'm not sure what to do. What's the best combination of workers and equipment for getting the job done?
Marge has to wash 1,000 dishes per week. Since she wants to maximize profit, she wants to minimize the cost of getting the dishes washed. Both labor and capital can be utilized to wash dishes, but they are not perfect substitutes, and there are many different combinations of labor and capital that enable Marge to clean the same number of dishes. If we plot all the combinations of capital and labor that can be used to wash 1,000 dishes, the curve is called an isoquant. Iso meaning equal, and quant meaning quantities. Equal quantities.
I get it.
If we start with lots of capital and little labor, a 1-unit change in labor will substitute for a relatively large quantity of capital. Conversely, if we start with lots of labor and little capital, 1 additional unit of capital will substitute for a relatively large amount of labor. The rate at which resources can be substituted while maintaining constant output is referred to as marginal rate of technical substitution, which can be determined at any point along the curve by measuring the slope. Higher levels of production require use of more labor and capital. Thus we have an isoquant for every level of output. As Marge plans her expansion, she predicts how many dishes she'll have and the combinations of labor and capital that can do the work. But for now, the isoquant line for 1,000 units is her constraint, representing her current dishwashing load.
I know I can substitute machines for labor and vice versa. But what's the right combination for me?
The decision is governed in part by cost. Each resource has a given cost. Marge pays $10 per hour to run the dishwashing machine and $5 per hour to employ a worker to wash dishes by hand. It takes a worker 40 hours per week to handle her current dish load. This translates to a cost of $200 per week for dishwashing labor. This line represents all the combinations of worker and machine that can be purchased at the cost of $200 per week. It is called an isocost line, meaning
equal cost.
the isoquant line for 1,000 dishes drops below the isocost line for $200. This tells us that Marge could be spending less each week if she used a combination of worker and machine to clean them. An isocost line for $100 per week, however, does not even intersect her isoquant. In other words, Marge would be left with dirty dishes at the end of the week. Marge's dishwashing operation is most efficient when she spends $150 per week on a combination of worker and machine. This isocost line is tangent to the isoquant curve. It intersects the curve at only one point. Every other point on the isoquant curve costs more to produce. As Ostrich Burger expands, Marge will have more dishes to wash. In other words, she'll be operating on higher isoquant curves. For each isoquant curve, there is a tangential isocost line that represents minimum cost. If we connect the points of optimal efficiency, we can plot Marge's expansion path. It represents the units of labor and capital that Marge will need for dishwashing as she expands her operation.
I sure do like the shape of things to come.
In studying economics, we assume that the firm's objective is to maximize economic profit. Profit is revenue minus costs. Marge hasn't said much about her revenue, but we know she is concerned about her costs.
With all these workers, my costs have gone way up, but that hasn't done much for productivity.
In the short run, the total cost curve flattens, then rises more sharply at higher levels of production. The marginal cost curve is U-shaped, falling as production efficiency increases, then rising as efficiency is compromised by crowding or inadequate facilities. Now let's consider revenue. In a large competitive market, the firm can sell as little or as much as it chooses at the market price. Under these circumstances, total revenue increases uniformly as the number of units sold increases. Marge's goal is to maximize profit. Maximum profit occurs where total revenue exceeds total cost by the largest amount. Now let's examine production and profit with respect to marginal cost and marginal revenue. Marginal revenue is the addition to total revenue that results from selling one more unit of output. In this case, the firm receives equal revenue from the sale of each additional unit. Thus, the marginal revenue is constant as the number of units sold increases. By extending a line down from the top graph to the bottom graph, we see that maximum profit occurs at a point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. This is the golden rule of profit maximization. Here's why. In a situation where marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, the profit-maximizing firm will happily expand output because producing one more unit adds more to total revenue than to total cost, thus increasing profit. Conversely, if marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue and marginal cost is increasing, then the firm will scale back production because expanding output has a negative impact on profit. The optimal level of production occurs where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, the point of maximum profit as dictated by the golden rule.
Remember the golden rule.
You may have noticed that there is another point where marginal revenue intersects marginal cost. You can see from the graphs that this is the point where profit is minimized.